I feel privileged to introduce Dr. Srijani. Dr. Srijani Bhattacharjee is a research fellow at the Abul Kalam Azad Institute of Asian Studies, Kolkata. She has done her MPhil and PhD from Center for Historical Studies, JNU, New Delhi. She has several publications to her credit. Some of her articles are published in Journal from Sage. She has a chapter in an edited book from Taylor and Francis and journal from Indian Institute of Advanced Studies, Shimla. Her research area concentrates on the colonial and post-colonial environmental history of Northeast India, human nature interfaces among the tribes in Mizoram, Meghalaya, and Arunachal Pradesh. Before joining Makayas, Kolkata, she was assistant professor of history at Adamas University, Kolkata. She was also engaged with the Asiatic Society as research fellow. So, Dr. Bhattacharjee, welcome to this session and please enlighten us with your lecture and hope we will enjoy and we will surely be enriched with your talk. Over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Tinni Goswami. First of all, I would like to convey my thanks to the Department of History, St. Xavier's College, Kolkata, Raghabpur branch, Kolkata, and other organizers of this 5-day online international faculty development program for giving me this opportunity to present a paper here. The topic on which I shall be speaking today is dimensions of environmental history in Northeast India. Shrimanti, can you start with the PPT?
I request our technical team to start the PPT on behalf of Dr. Bhattacharjee, please. Thank you.
Okay. So the topic on which I shall be speaking today is dimensions of environmental history in Northeast India. But before I go into the details of the topic, I'd like to give a brief understanding about what environmental history is all about. How did this field of inquiry come into being? What are the approaches to the study of environmental history? Next slide, please. Now, environmental history is that branch of study that focuses on human interaction with the natural world from historical perspective. Now, since time immemorial, we know that nature has played a vital role in shaping human culture and civilization. Similarly, man has also played a vital role in shaping and altering the natural environment. So this field of historical enquiry, it emphasizes on the active role played by nature in influencing human affairs and vice versa. Environmental history is a multidisciplinary subject. I'll go into the details of this aspect in my later slides. And since it is a multidisciplinary subject, it draws widely from social sciences, economics and management, commerce and management, and natural sciences also. Next slide, please. Now, why this field of inquiry came into being? Environmental history is actually, it is a reaction. This genre of historical writing emerged as a reaction to worldwide environmental problems like pollution of water, air, deforestation, depletion of ozone layers, and diminution of flora and fauna. So when these natural changes started coming up, the historians also tried to understand the changes from historical perspective, and thus we find the emergence of environmental history as a historical inquiry, as a branch of historical inquiry. Environmental history, it takes within its fold conservation issues like protection of the natural environment, safeguarding the flora and fauna, and human-nature relationship. It also includes aspects like physical impact of human beings on Earth, its resources, water, and biosphere. Now, environmental history takes into account the consequences produced by increasing population, and with increasing population, and there has been increasing consumption of natural resources. What was the impact of such increasing consumption of natural resources on nature, and the implementation of scientific forestry programs or practices over nature and its commercial utilization. Now here I would like to clarify, like, what is scientific forestry all about. Scientific forestry is actually a German concept that focuses on use, utilization, exploitation, and manipulation of nature in order to generate economic returns from it with the application of scientific principles. So this is the basic idea of scientific forestry. It is a German concept, and we find that this concept was adapted by European powers in their colonies in order to establish control over the indigenous forest resources of the colonies, in order to commercially exploit the natural resources of their colony. So environmental history deals with these aspects. Now here I'd like to give you a brief understanding, like what is the historical background of environmental history, like why this field of inquiry came into being. Now, after the Industrial Revolution in England, we find large-scale industrialization, urbanization, and consequent to large-scale industrialization and urbanization, we find that there was rise in pollution level, there was rise in air, water, and noise pollution. So as a result, we find that due to this natural changes in the natural environment, we find some consciousness emerging among the people of the country. Like they tried to find out, like, what is the reason, and certainly these changes were not positive in character, they were negative in character. So therefore we find that by the 1870s, we find environmental movements coming up in England against large-scale industrialization and urbanization, and large-scale pollution also. Then during the 1920s, we find the emergence of the Annales School of History writing in France. Annales School emphasizes on total history, that is, whatever is connected with mankind has to be the subject matter or can be the subject matter of history writing. So since natural environment is an intimate part of human civilization and human culture, so therefore the interrelationship between human and nature was studied from historical perspective in Annals School. By the later years or second half of the 20th century, we find that movements coming up in America. By the 1960s and 70s, we find movements coming up in America against large-scale industrialization, urbanization, deforestation, rising pollution level. To be more specific, there were more movements on the release of toxic waste by industries in the forms of batteries, in the forms of machines, in the form of pesticides and computer equipments. So as a result of all these factors, a consciousness or an awareness started emerging in the minds of social scientists also, and the historians took up this field of inquiry, they started understanding the problems from historical perspective, and thus we find the emergence of this field of study. Next slide, please. Now, approaches to environmental history. Researchers in environmental history. First, it is the study of human involvement with nature. As I have told already, it is the study of human involvement with nature. Then environmental history focuses on the economic and technological side of human actions. As we have talked about scientific forestry practices, I have told about scientific forestry practices, that is the nature, how to exploit nature in order to generate economic returns from it. Since generation of revenue formed an a vital part of scientific forestry practices, and scientific forestry practices are an integral part of environmental history. Therefore, it is essentially an economic history, that is, how much forest revenue has been generated, whether there was rise or decline in revenue from a certain area, what species should be planted in order to generate more revenue, etc. So, from this perspective, we can say that it is essentially an economic history. And since it talks about application of scientific principles, it talks about application of botanical principles, it talks about application of zoological and geological principles. Apart from this, other principles like working plans, like how forests should be worked in order to generate economic returns, silvicultural practices, horticultural practices, establishment of plantations. So these aspects also form an essential part of environmental history. Therefore, it can be considered as technological history also. Environmental history focuses on the impact of colonization and associated efforts of industrialization over natural resources, the role of humans in altering the natural environment around the world. And along with this concept, that is, what was the impact of colonization over natural resources? Just connected with it is another aspect, that how it marginalized the indigenous forest rights of the people, how the implementation of colonial forest policies hampered the indigenous forest rights of the people. Since this indigenous aspect is also an important part of the study, and for understanding this indigenous aspect, one has to know about indigenous methods of forest management, indigenous forest knowledge, indigenous methods of forest preservation. Therefore, a knowledge about the cultural, social, and religious and ethnic aspect, along with economic and political aspects of a certain community, is vital. From this perspective, it is a cultural history also. And since it talks about environmental concepts, just now we have spoken about scientific forestry, it speaks about various indigenous concepts also, concepts related to forest management. Therefore, it can be considered as an intellectual history also. And since in environmental history, we take the help of history, we take the help of economics, we take the help of cultural, religious, and social studies, we take the help of commercial management, and we take the help of scientific principles, and botanical, zoological, and geological principles also. From this perspective, it is a multidisciplinary study. Next slide, please. Now, environmental history is another aspect is political history. Environmental history is also a political history, because application of forest administration or control over a certain forest area is not possible without application of political administration. So therefore, from this perspective, it is a political history also. And since it talks about laws, regulations, and legislations regarding flora and fauna, therefore it is a study on policy making as well. On policies also, it is a study connected with policies also. Therefore, a person undertaking a research in environmental history necessarily need not be a historian. He may be a geographer, he or she may be a geographer, an ecologist, a sociologist, and anthropologist, because the subject has so many dimensions. The subject matter of environmental history is often the same of historical geography or historical ecology, although the choice of sources might vary. Now, in historical ecology, actually historical ecology may be defined as a research program that focuses on interactions between humans and their natural environment over a longer period of time. And in historical ecology, paleoecology, archaeological investigation, studies on land use pattern, sources of ecological and geographical researches are undertaken. These are the types of sources which are usually consulted in the case of historical ecology. But in the case of environmental history, the type of sources consulted are different. In environmental history, we take the help of primary sources that consist of archaeological sources, government documents, old newspapers, diaries, letters, journals, magazines, souvenirs, then works by administrators, officials, works by indigenous people. When we study about indigenous forest knowledge, we take the help of oral literature. It may be written literature, and oral literature are also of great help for the communities who did not have written literature earlier. So we find that taking the help of folk traditions and legends can be of great help. Then visual sources can be of great help in environmental history, and environmental history often deals with contemporary issues also. It also deals with aspects which are not very old. So what we find that for understanding those topics or for researching those areas of environmental history, interviewing can be of great help. So since environmental history studies human and flora fauna relations, therefore growth of zoological parks, game sanctuaries, exploration of new animal and plant species, and establishment of botanical gardens, etc., are included within this fold of study. Next slide, please. Now, environmental history may be regional or global in character. In regional environmental history, usually the regional issues connected with the natural environment are described, discussed, and analyzed. And regional environmental history may be a part of regional history also, that focuses on specificities and commonness of a certain region that distinguishes the region from the other. But in global environmental history, usually the global environmental problems and changes are researched on, like like rise in climate change, then sea level rise, then large scale deforestation, urban air pollution, impact of global population growth on nature, etc. This can be subject matter of global environmental history. Then we find that forming knowledge about regional environmental history is comparatively easier compared to global environmental history, because in global environmental history one has to deal with global problems, and for understanding those problems, the sources which are to be consulted in the case of global environmental histories are documents, visual materials, and other sources that focus on trade, exploration, climate change, cultural exchange, and global commodities in world history. But in regional environmental history, the sources which I have mentioned just now, those are to be consulted. So we find the variations in consultation of sources between global and environmental, regional environmental history. Next slide, please. Now I come to Northeast India. That is, we know that the easternmost part of India is known as Northeast India, and that comprises of 8 states of the region, and the 8 states are Assam, Meghalaya, Manipur, Tripura, Nagaland, Mizoram, Arunachal Pradesh, and Sikkim. So these are the 8 states of Northeast India. The entire region is habited of various communities having different cultures, ethnic, social norms, and religions. The entire region is also geographically varied, because the region consists of both plains and hills. The Brahmaputra Valley is a plains region, but the surrounding hill states are primarily hill regions. So we find that there are geographical and topographical variations, and there are demographic variations as well. So since the region is varied in demography, therefore we find diverse traditions of indigenous forest use and management in the region. Now, here I would like to give you a brief understanding about the history of the region. The region became a part of Assam after the First Anglo-Burmese War under the clauses of the Treaty of Yandabu in 1826. So during this period, the entire region, excepting the princely states of Manipur and Tripura, was known as Assam. Only the states of Manipur and Tripura were not within Assam. Apart from that, the other parts of the area was known as Assam. And Sikkim was included in the list very recently. Therefore, Sikkim was also not a part of the region. So the hill states surrounding the Brahmaputra plains or the Assam Valley or the plains of Assam, those were districts, hill districts within Assam under the British administration. And prior to the coming of the British, the Assam Valley region was ruled by the Ahom rulers who had ruled the region from 13th century till the initiation of the British administration over the region. And the hill areas were either some conglomeration of chieftainships or monarchies. They were collection of chieftainship or monarchies or other forms of political administration. So such was the situation prior to the coming of the British. Here in this next slide, please. Next slide. So here in this map, you can see that Khasi Hills, you can see the map, Manipur and Tripura, these were not parts of Assam, and Khasi Hills was a collection of monarchical units. Similarly, Jaintia Hills was also a collection of monarchical units. So under the British, we find that the Khasi, Jaintia and the Garo tribes, which are matrilineal tribes, the areas inhabited by these three matrilineal tribes was converted into a district, that is United Khasi and Jaintia Hills, and it was a district under the British administration of Assam. Next slide, please. So this is the map of present-day Northeast India, where you can find the 8 states which I have mentioned. Now, dimensions. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Okay. So dimensions of environmental history in Northeast India. So environmental history in Northeast India analyzes the impact of British administration and colonialism over the natural resources of the province. It mainly deals with various strategies and political British forest administration in the region that have resulted in the establishment of colonial control over the natural resources of the province and carving of indigenous forest rights in the region. So these two aspects of environmental history related to Northeast India is more or less similar with other part of the country. But despite such commonness, we find that the environmental history of Northeast India has some specificities also, because the type of forest administration applied in the hills and the plains district of the region was not similar. Next slide. Now, we find that in the plains of Assam, we find that there was direct administration of British Forest Department, where there was reservation of forest areas, that is, forest areas were demarcated as reserves. But in the hill areas, we find that the political administration was handled by the political officers, who also supervised the management of the forest, but they did not intrude into the indigenous methods of forest management in the area. So they did not intrude.
I have a request to the participants. Kindly mute your mic. Sorry, Dr. Srijani Bhattacharjee. You please continue.
Okay. So we find that in the case of hill areas of Assam, we find that the British government preferred lesser interference. Therefore, they did not interfere much in the internal administration of the tribes, although there were reservation of some forest areas, like the riverine areas were mostly reserved in order to curb shifting cultivation or on climatic grounds. So since the British administration related to the area, it preferred lesser interference. It tried to develop knowledge about the cultural traditions, social, ethnic, and religious traditions, or the economic and political aspect connected with indigenous methods of forest administration. And for doing that, one has to have, as I have told earlier also, one has to have a knowledge about the cultural, social, ethnic, and all the other aspects of a certain community. So from this perspective, it can be said that it is also a holistic history. Because for understanding such specificities, a brief idea about the social, religious, and cultural aspects of the communities, along with their economic and political structure, is required. Then it is a study on policy making also, because the subject or this genre of historical study, it deals with forest, faunal, and mineral policies and legislations implemented in the region. Like we find that in the case of Assam, we find that though the Forest Act of 1864 and the Forest Act of 1878 were implemented, but considering the specificities of the region, regional specificities, we find that the Assam Forest Regulation of 1891 was implemented over the region, which was not implemented elsewhere. And the environmental history of the region certainly deals with various provisions of the Assam Forest Regulation implemented over the region, because Assam was a vast region, as I have said. So from this perspective, it is a study on policy making. Next slide, please. Now, since Northeast India is rich in mineral resources like petroleum, coal, etc., along with many other types of mineral resources, therefore, the environmental history of the region can be a history on the mineral resources of the region too. Like it can trace exploitation, commercialization, management, and administration of mineral resources found in the area. Then it can deal with aspects like establishment of wildlife sanctuaries and national parks in the region. So from this perspective, it deals with certain zoological aspects as well. Then we find that floral varieties from Assam were taken to England for botanical experiments. Similarly, species from England were brought to Assam in order to see if those plant species could thrive in the climatic conditions of the region. So such history of such aspects can be the subject matter of environmental history. And we know that environmental history is essentially an economic history of any region. And in the case of Northeast India also, it is an economic history because it deals with revenue administration. It deals with plantation economy, because when we talk about Assam, we cannot ignore tea. So when tea plants were discovered in the region, during that period, we find that the tea planters, they emerged as the largest proprietors of forest lands in Assam. So later, when we find the British Forest Department, because Forest Department was established in the region by the later part of the 19th century. So when Forest Department was established in the region, it developed some kind of clashes because the tea planters were not in favor of forest reserve. So such kind of things can be interesting areas of environmental history, and works have been done on this. And revenue administration, like since Assam was a very vast area with a scanty population, therefore we find that large areas were lying unoccupied and unused, which the British termed as wastelands. So in order to convert these wastelands into cultivable areas or agricultural fields, we find that under the encouragement of the British government, we find that there was large-scale immigration of East Bengal peasants in the area in the first half of the 20th century, from late 19th to early, first half of the 20th century. So there was large-scale changes as a result of all this. So these can be subject matters, and these are certainly parts of economic history. The coming of railways in the region, with the coming of railways in the region, there was rise in tea production, there was rise in trade in forest products. So these areas are important subject matter or dimensions of environmental history in Northeast India. Now, next slide, please. Next slide. So, environmental history of the region is largely a scientific and technological history of the territory. So, can you go to the previous slide? Because I think, yes. So environmental history of the region is largely a scientific and technological history of the region. As I have said already, that it includes within its study application of botanical ideas over a certain forest areas, zoological ideas over faunal species, and geological applications. So we find applications of scientific concepts like working plants, silviculture, sowing of new plant species, plantations, etc. So from this perspective, it is a scientific history also. And since it talks about indigenous forest management, it talks about indigenous nature-based practices, beliefs, and nature management and preservation mechanisms. Therefore, it is a community study also. It is a community study also. So you can see that there are many dimensions of the subject. And we find that at present, researchers are coming up on the role of rivers in the growth of human cultures and settlements in the region. We find Arupjati Saikia has worked on it. He has written a book named The Unquiet River, a biography of the Brahmaputra. So we find such works coming up, and further works on the role of rivers in the formation of human culture and civilization can be undertaken. Then we find that thus we find that the sphere of inquiry is an amalgamation of cultural, social, political, and anthropological studies and history combined with natural, zoological, and geological sciences. So next slide, please. So the role of women in forest use, manage, and preservation of biodiversity from historical perspective can be an important area of inquiry, because for example, in Arunachal Pradesh we find that women play an important role in preservation of nature. The indigenous medicinal practitioners in Arunachal Pradesh, there are many women who are experts in indigenous medicine. So therefore work on historical aspect of this area can be undertaken. And since environmental history, and another dimension I would like to mention here, that agro-medical research on indigenous medicinal practices from historical perspective can be also undertaken under this genre of historical inquiry. Now, it is also an intellectual history of the region, because it includes within its fold both indigenous and colonial concepts related to nature use, exploitation, and management. At present, the researchers on environmental history in Northeast India is not only confined to colonial era. Works on pre-colonial era has also been undertaken, like the types of forest administration applied by the Ahom rulers. Works have been undertaken on this. Then disaster history can be an integral part of analysis pertaining to the region. Like I can say that Northeast India is prone to disasters like landslides, earthquakes, and floods. What had been the role of these disasters in shaping human culture and civilization in the area can be an important arena of historical research on Northeast India. So this is one. And next slide, please. Now, researches are undertaken in the post-colonial era also. Researchers on post-colonial era deal with climatic changes, large-scale deforestation, impact of modern development, and rise in population on the natural resources of the region. Researchers can be worked on these areas. Some works have come up, like we find that historical work has come up on the question like why rainfall has decreased in Cherrapunji. Previously, Cherrapunji was considered as the wettest place on earth. Now, the title of wettest place has been given to Mosindram. What are the historical factors that led to the decrease of the volume of rainfall in Cherrapunji? Works have come up on this. And again, I would say that policy making in the post-colonial era can be an important area of study on environmental history in the region, and creation of urban spaces, how the natural environment have been changed and manipulated in order to create urban spaces. So these kind of works can be undertaken in environmental history. And that's it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Srijani, for your informative and analytical presentation. And we have some questions for you. So,
Yes.
the first question I would like to take from Sadanand Pandit. I'm reading it for you as it might be an observation. Let's see. As we know that tribal people have contributed a lot in the protection and conservation of the environment and natural resources, even the government has accepted this by enacting the Forest Right Act 2006, whereby their rights are recognized. Once their right is recognized, can it be questioned by the court?
Now, in the case of Northeast India, we find that maximum forest rights have been given to the indigenous communities. I am talking about the hill areas, because in hill areas we find that 90% of the forest are indigenous forest or forest under indigenous control, and only 10% forests are under state control. So in the case of Northeast India, you the picture is different. But yes, certainly it can be questioned. Like in 1996, we find that the Supreme Court had imposed a ban on timber cutting in Arunachal Pradesh along with other parts of Northeast India, because there was rampant felling of timber and exploitation of natural resources. And we find that the Supreme Court had imposed a ban. But later the ban was removed, because in Northeast India, most of the communities, they depend on forests for their livelihood. So such kind of ban was interfering with the livelihood of the people, and there were protests also against the ban. So later an organization, forest, I think Arunachal Pradesh Development Corporation, a body by this name was formed in order to keep a vigil over the indigenous forest management, I mean forest exploitation of the area. So this was one of the the ban imposed by Supreme Court, but later it was removed. But in the case of Northeast India, we find that preference has always been given to the people, and the state government hardly can interfere in that, because the state government cannot impose their rules and regulations in the indigenous forest, where the orders or the policies of the indigenous authorities are supreme. So thank you.
Thank you. There are two more questions.
Yes.
One from Mr. Sarveswar Shahu. The question is there any connection of Northeast India's natural resources in setting up of Kolkata as their first capital?
In the case of Northeast, like when Kolkata was formed, at that time Northeast India was under indigenous control. The exploitation of forest resources in Northeast India started from the later half of it became more intense in the later half of the 19th century, and in the first half of the 20th century the exploitation increased. The exploitation was more during the First World War, and it increased during the Second World War. So in regard to formation of Kolkata, I do not think there has been any connection, because but in the later years, yes, forest resources from Northeast India were used in other areas, because the sal forest found in Assam, those were used for making railway sleepers in various parts of the world. We find that in the post-colonial era, like for example, I can say that the forests of Arunachal Pradesh were exploited to a large extent in order to supply timber for the Asian Games in 1982. So such kind of things we do find after independence and in the first half of the 20th century. So that's it.
Um, I would like to take one last question, and as I have mentioned earlier, that we are running shortage of time, and definitely we will be sending those questions which we cannot take here via mail to our respected speaker, and she will be answering your questions or will be clarifying your doubts as well. Please bear with us. So the last question which I would like to take, it's from Aryadev Roy Chaudhary. His question is, Madam, what is the history of origin of social forestry in India?
Social forestry, what I understand is that the role of society in preservation and management of forest. In the case of Northeast India, such traditions prevailed since time immemorial. But in the case of, forest administration or forest policies, we find that such kind of concepts appeared during the early 90s, like the joint forest management came up in West Bengal, first of all. Later on, it was implemented in other parts of Northeast India, where there is a joint collaboration between the indigenous people and the forest department in management and preservation of nature. So such things, such concepts related to preservation of nature are encouraged by the forest department at present, forest administration of India at present. But during the colonial period, period, we do not find emphasis on such issues. These issues began to be emphasized in the post-colonial period, and JFM is a concept which is applied all over India, and it emphasizes on the joint collaboration between the forest administration and indigenous forest practices, and with the sharing of revenues. Certainly there is some sharing of revenue between the forest administration and the people. So on the basis of that, such kind of things we do find. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much. And we will be definitely sending the rest of the questions to our respected speaker. Hope our esteemed participants will understand that we have some limitations also. And now I would like to request Dr. Srijani Bhattacharjee to introduce the next speaker. Thank you.